Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Boss Economics World. Today, we're diving headfirst into the tangled web of France's economic and political crisis, where fiscal mismanagement, political power struggles, and looming budgetary deficits are fueling uncertainty for one of Europe's biggest economies. Let me put it straight, France is in a mess, and it's one that could have rippling effects across the Eurozone economy. So, buckle up as we unravel how the government's poor decision-making is pushing the country toward economic ruin. Let's start with the basics. French Prime Minister Michel Barnier won a small reprieve this week, courtesy of S&P Global Ratings, which reaffirmed France's AA credit rating despite ongoing political chaos. Sounds like a piece of good news, right? Well, don't get too comfortable. This rating is essentially a band-aid stuck on a gaping wound the size of France's budget deficit. Make no mistake, the situation is dire. To really grasp the problem here, we have to zoom out and look at what's happening under the hood. Ever since President Emmanuel Macron's snap elections flopped, France has been teetering on the edge of political disarray. The National Assembly is fractured between three bickering factions: the left, Macron's dwindling centrist backing, and the far-right National Rally led by none other than Marine Le Pen. This political fragmentation is straight-up disastrous for fiscal policy coherence, and it's downright paralyzing the government's ability to pass the crucial 2025 budget. In fact, the stalemate is so bad that S&P pointed out that France's rising political fragmentation complicates fiscal governance. And here's the kicker: France's budget deficit is already sitting at a staggering 6.1% of GDP in 2024, far worse than the 4.4% they'd hoped to hit. If this sounds bad, buckle up, folks. The situation gets even spicier. Michel Barnier's minority government, formed under emergency circumstances after Macron's plans collapsed, is limping along, trying to stitch together a 2025 budget, a tall order, given the climate he's working in. But here's the real clincher: the €60 billion, $63.3 billion, in tax hikes and budget cuts that Barnier's struggling to pass could be dead in the water if Le Pen and her allies follow through on their threats for a no-confidence motion next week. You hear that? That's the sound of impending political doom. Now, let's talk about the bond market for a second. Bond traders are famously good barometers of economic health, and France is feeling the pinch here in a big way. In the past 2 weeks alone, France's bonds have come under renewed pressure. The gap between French and German 10-year bond yields shot up to 90 basis points, the highest since 2012. Traders see the writing on the wall, and what they're reading is, high risk ahead. For those of you who might not be steeped in bond market jargon, the bond spread in simple terms is like a U-turn sign for investors. When the gap between German and French bonds widens like this, it screams, we don't trust France as much as we used to. This premium, therefore, is not just a technical issue, it's an actual market signal that France's ability to manage its fiscal house, to grow, to pay off its debts, and to keep its economy on the rails, is being called into serious question. And that's not where the money market mess ends. French bond yields spooked fast enough for the European Central Bank, ECB, to take notice, with the market now pricing in expectations for faster interest rate cuts from the ECB. Yes, folks, that means investors are already bracing for a more aggressive easing policy to soften the blow if this French fiscal madness spills into the broader European economy. Let's get behind the numbers now. France's budget deficit is slated to clock in at 6.1% of GDP in 2024, way off track from their 4.4% target. Michel Barnier is soldiering on, pushing for the deficit to shrink to 5% next year, but it's laughable considering the hurdles this government is facing. Remember, €60 billion in spending cuts and tax hikes are in the pipeline, but with political vultures circling, there's no telling whether these policies will ever see the light of day. Even if Barnier manages to scrape through this no-confidence vote, a big if, this whole strenuous effort may reduce the fiscal deficit by a modest 0.1% of GDP. And analysts are chiming in that the 2025 fiscal consolidation plan may end up being even more limited, thanks to Barnier's concessions to the far right's demands and concessions to the left. But let's face it, France's fiscal dilemma is nothing new. Since the global financial crisis of 2008, France has been playing catch-up, averaging high deficits year after year. Does anyone actually believe this fiscal mess can be solved by trimming deficits by a measly fraction? Not likely. This is where we have to face the real cornerstone of the crisis, the no-confidence vote. Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally Party and the left-wing opposition are rallying their forces, getting ready to bring down Barnier's minority government over this budget proposal. If Barnier can't hold this fragile coalition together, the consequences will be devastating. Let's reiterate, if the far left and far right join forces next week, we could be talking about a government toppling over fiscal policies. Given France's importance to the overall stability of Europe, this political fallout could easily spill over into Brussels and beyond. But it doesn't stop there. Even if Barnier somehow survives this vote, France is still looking at prolonged fiscal uncertainty. There will likely be multiple no-confidence votes in December, each one threatening to throw a wrench into the delicate machinery of public finance. Here's where things get even crazier. No matter what Barnier does to cling to power, France is likely staring down the barrel of an economic recession. High inflation, coupled with sluggish GDP growth, is corroding business confidence. Consumer sentiment is tanking, and French households are getting jittery. But worse, investor confidence in France's economic future is brittle at best. This mess is strangling France's export sector, which is supposed to be one of the redeeming qualities of the French economy, as S&P points out in its relatively subdued Friday statement. While France remains resilient in some areas like private sector saving rates and some aspects of its labor market, the larger macro picture isn't encouraging at all. S&P struggled, let's be honest, to find any significant bright spots in the French economy. Among the few crumbs offered was the observation that France remains resilient thanks, in part, to the country's participation in the European Union, an institution that's historically provided member countries with an economic lifeboat in times of crisis, thanks to its market integration and fiscal oversight capabilities. Now don't get me wrong, being a part of the EU does provide a cushion. But to rely vehemently on it as a key driver of stability ignores just how narrow that margin is becoming, especially when you consider the EU itself is going through challenges of its own, including growth stagnation and policy disputes between member states. Over-reliance on the EU to bail out mismanaged domestic policies? Well, folks, that's like dressing up a tumor with a band-aid and saying, at least it's covered. Here's the reality, S&P did France a favor by reaffirming its AA credit rating. But they were clear, their patience is waning. The report was blunt, any failure to bring the deficit down or any signs of prolonged economic slowdown could easily trigger further credit downgrades ahead. Barnier and Finance Minister Antoine Armand may have tried to put a brave face on it, with Armand lauding the fact that S&P acknowledged the government's fiscal repair efforts. But talk is cheap. The pressure is now squarely on the government to achieve tangible progress quickly while avoiding the political landmines currently littering the budget approval process. The real danger here isn't just another degradation in credit ratings. France could very well find itself in a situation where it struggles to borrow at favorable rates, leading to a debt spiral that mirrors the fiasco we've witnessed in other European countries during past crises. Let's put this in context, France is still 7 notches above junk bond status. So that gives them some breathing room, but if political infighting continues to stall budgetary reforms, that spread between French and German bonds will only grow wider. As bond yields climb, France's ability to sustainably finance its debt will become ever more difficult. Then comes the vicious cycle, higher yields mean more debt servicing costs, translating to more brutal cuts in public services and hikes in taxes. One bright spot S&P did mention is Macron's ongoing labor market reforms, some of which look promising. But here's the catch, to get out of this economic quagmire, France would need not just piecemeal reforms but a full-scale structural transformation, and this, friends, is where the real uphill battle begins. Macron's labor market reforms are largely in limbo due to the fractured political landscape and vehement opposition from the left. If you take a step back, it's clear as day, France's labor market regulation is one of the most rigid in the developed world. This rigidity hobbles entrepreneurship, stifling business creation and innovation, 2 key engines of long-term economic growth. That said, while Macron's earlier reforms, like loosening labor laws to make hiring and firing easier, were steps in the right direction, recent political gridlock is preventing any substantive changes from moving forward. In fact, the current political chaos, with no clear majority in the National Assembly, means that even the most modest labor reforms are likely to remain stalled. The French economy needs labor flexibility to adapt to future challenges, but with political factions pulling in opposite directions, unfortunately, there seems to be little hope for significant improvement in the near term. We can't talk about fiscal policy without addressing the revenue side of the equation. Efficient tax collection is key to balancing budgets, yet France is facing a massive shortfall in tax revenues, adding more fuel to the fiscal fire. To put this into perspective, France's government initially predicted that its tax revenues would shrink the deficit to 4.4% in 2024. However, they have now revised this down to 6.1%, with things looking even bleaker going into 2025. The shortfall is a direct result of slower economic growth. The broader economy isn't generating enough wealth or business activity to feed into government coffers, meaning public finances are falling into disrepair faster than expected. Inflation, weaker growth, and an underperforming revenue collection system are all conspiring to deepen this gap. What's worse? Even as Barnier's government scrambles to cut spending and raise taxes, longer-term growth forecasts look disturbingly weak. Since France's economy isn't growing fast enough to generate the taxable revenue needed to close these budgetary holes, it's likely the gap will widen even further before stabilizing. What makes this fiscal dysfunction particularly worrisome is the likelihood of extensive public pushback. France has a notorious history of public protest in response to austerity measures, and if the government ramps up 60 billion euros in proposed spending cuts while simultaneously raising taxes, you can bet on rising social unrest. Already, we've seen signs of brewing discontent among labor unions and civil society groups, gearing up to oppose any significant cuts to social benefits, pensions, or public sector wages, all major budget expenditure categories on the chopping block. This brings us to a core issue, the paradox of fiscal consolidation. On the one hand, France is staring at unsustainable debts, and something needs to be done. But, on the other hand, cutting public services or imposing higher taxes might weaken consumer spending, create job losses, and further slow down the very growth needed to revive the economy. In addition, reducing social safety nets, the very policies that have maintained relative stability, is dangerous. People in France are already feeling pinched by the cost of living crisis and inflation, which has eroded purchasing power across the board. French households, especially from lower and middle income brackets, are becoming increasingly dependent on social transfers. Any cuts in pensions, unemployment benefits, or subsidies could be met with mass protests similar to the 2018 Yellow Vest movement, which almost brought Macron's government to its knees. As this domestic anger builds up, France risks becoming even more ungovernable. After all, fiscal responsibility may be crucial, but it won't matter if the government loses its legitimacy among the people. Let's talk now about the bigger picture, France's role as a pillar of the Eurozone. This isn't just about France's domestic economy. What happens in France doesn't stay in France. As the second largest economy in the Eurozone, France's fiscal health is paramount to Europe's overall stability. If France continues to show signs of instability or fiscal profligacy, the implications for the rest of the Eurozone are monumental. A downgrade in France's credit rating or a prolonged budget crisis could easily sap investor confidence in other southern European economies like Italy, Spain, or Greece, where public finances are equally fragile. There's been widespread pressure on the European Central Bank, ECB, to maintain a supportive monetary policy stance and keep borrowing costs low. However, a debt crisis in France could force the ECB into a difficult position. It's already facing significant inflationary pressure and may be limited in how much further it can cut rates or extend bond buying programs over the long term. Loose monetary policy might be needed to prevent a full-blown crisis, but it risks inflaming inflation and further complicating the ECB's ability to maintain price stability. And let's not forget the effects this could have on confidence in the euro itself. If France, a core Eurozone power, continues hurtling toward deeper political fragmentation and economic instability, international investors might start viewing the Eurozone as a less credible economic bloc. This threatens to open up long-standing questions about the future of the EU's fiscal union, with arguments once again surfacing around debt mutualization and whether wealthier northern states, ahem, Germany, should be doing more to backstop weaker economies. A crisis of governance in France may just be the spark that reignites fierce European debates about risk-sharing, fiscal discipline, and the future of the euro. Now, here's a topic not enough people are talking about. Income inequality in France is growing, and it's going to get worse as this crisis deepens. It's one of those slow-burn issues that don't get attention until it boils over and causes an uprising, but let's break it down. The rising cost of living, stoked by both inflation and stagnant wages, is squeezing the middle class. On top of that, wealthier regions of France, especially cities like Paris, are increasingly benefiting from the modest economic growth that does exist, leaving rural areas and poorer regions even further behind. The deepening income divide between the urban elites and the working-class populace, especially in neglected regions, poses a real threat to social cohesion. And this inequality isn't just theoretical, it's a political minefield. Throughout modern French history, economic inequality has been one of the primary drivers of political disorder. Remember the Gilets jaunes, Yellow Vests, movement that rocked the Macron administration? That wasn't just about fuel taxes. It was about a larger sense of disenfranchisement, about large swaths of the population feeling left behind by the prosperity enjoyed by the urban upper class. As France's income gap increases, the national rally, led by Marine Le Pen, is almost certainly going to gain more ground, feeding off of popular discontent. And in the meantime, the political left will continue fighting any form of austerity, framing it as a further attack on the poor and working class. So, while France's fiscal trajectory may look to the rating agencies like a fiscal numbers game, within the country it's a ticking bomb of social unrest. So, what happens next? France is at a crossroad. Its economy is resilient enough for now, or at least that's what S&P tells us, but the country is walking an economic tightrope with no room for missteps. The immediate focus needs to be on fiscal consolidation, yes, but this can't be the only priority. France will need to actively reignite economic growth if it's to have any true success in stabilizing its finances over the long term. Simply cutting spending and raising taxes might help reduce the deficit in the short term, but if the overall economy continues to underperform, France could find itself trapped in a vicious cycle of low growth, high debt, and political chaos. Michel Barnier's minority government, if it survives the no-confidence vote, must figure out how to balance credible fiscal reforms with growth-enhancing policies like labor market liberalization, investment in innovation, and productivity improvements. This won't be easy given the political climate, but it's necessary. If Barnier's government falls, and that's looking increasingly likely given the opposition from Le Pen's far-right party and the left-wing groups, they may not even get the chance to pass any budget reforms at all, meaning another round of elections and potentially even greater instability. The risks for France and the Eurozone are as clear as day. Prolonged fiscal uncertainty, deepening political polarization, and market skepticism are threatening not just the French economy, but Europe as a whole. Let's be real here, unless France wakes up to the urgency of this crisis and begins implementing some meaningful economic reforms beyond just swinging the budget axe, the country is staring down the barrel of economic stagnation and social breakdown. The French version of laissez-faire, letting the crisis unfold while waiting for an external savior, the EU or ECB, won't cut it. Until next time, watch your wallets, my friends. The French fiscal train wreck isn't one you want to take lightly.